Hello all, welcome. Thank you for attending today's webinar. So as a prelude, I want to say that when I first developed the topic of today's presentation, I approached it with a long history of conducting pre-acquisition due diligence of contaminated properties. Thinking about the process from pre-acquisition to closure led to my development of a concept I called strategic environmental due diligence. But, funny enough, for some reason, that didn't seem to generate much enthusiasm. I was told it needed to be snappier, a little sexier, and a bit catchier. So I revisioned my concept to the premise of today's presentation, reducing the risk of developing risky sites. Now, admittedly, there is redundancy in the title, but all those R's floating around in it have made it a favorite of pirates everywhere. So at least there's that. Nonetheless, the focus of today's presentation is managing the risk and maximizing return on investment through the application of strategic environmental due diligence. Let's begin. So acquiring and developing a contaminated site requires the creation of a strategy to guide the buyer or investor to maximize return on investment. This is accomplished by accurately identifying and managing the risks prior to purchase and during the subsequent entitlements and development phases. I remember in the earliest days of my career that due diligence halted, I mean full stop, when actual or even a history of contamination was identified on the site. So what has changed since that time? Well, the regulatory model changed from the requirement of complete restoration to risk-based corrective action closure. And it led to a maturation of the due diligence process, a change in strategy to risk management over risk aversion. Now, risk aversion was not entirely abandoned by some investors or developers, but many of them got tired of bypassing the opportunities due to the mere hint of risk associated with an environmental issue. They began asking, how can I cost effectively manage the risks and still realize a target return on investment? With the assistance of informed legal counsel and environmental professionals, developers came to recognize the answer. So we'll start with the question, what is risk? Risk has many definitions, some very specific to the type of industry, practice, and goals. For property acquisition and development, the Cambridge Dictionary's definition, which is the effect of uncertainty on objectives, seems appropriate. Perhaps even more applicable, though, is the definition provided by Stanford University's chief risk officer, who defines risk as the possibility that the occurrence of an event will adversely affect the achievement of an organization's objectives. So previously, we talked about how the acquisition and development of contaminated sites require the accurate identification and management of risks. So what is risk management? Well, according to the Association of Project Management, it is part of a process that fosters the understanding and allows for the implementation of proactive management of identified risks. According to Wall Street Mojo, which is a web-based platform that provides learning solutions for finance professionals, risk management involves the identification of potential risks and taking strategic actions to mitigate those risks. The words proactive and strategic are the basis of the premise of reducing the risk of developing risky sites. So now we'll ask, what is risk in real estate? So the renowned and revered source of financial data and advice, Forbes, says at its core, real estate development is a game of risk. No surprise there for any of us that have played a continuing role in the realm of commercial real estate. And while there are many risks involved in commercial real estate, some of the key sources include geographic or market risk, sponsor risk, leasing or vacancy risk, tenant risk, cap rate risk, debt risk, physical asset risk, or development risk. Now, we won't delve into all these key risks now, but we'll look at some that apply to the acquisition and development of risky sites. So let's do that. What could be characterized as a key risk of developing risky sites? Capital risk, which is the potential loss of some or even all of your investment capital. Of course, this is the primary risk to avoid under any circumstances for any acquisition, but especially for acquisition of property and in particular risky sites. There's a physical asset risk that due to its physical condition, an investment property will incur unplanned costs or capital expenditures. Now, purchasing sites and renovating, rehabilitating, or repurposing existing structures requires an extensive pre-acquisition planning to manage the risks. And then, of course, there's development risk, that a property requiring significant development or redevelopment may pose risks to construction and entitlements. Like before, purchasing and development of contaminated sites requires extensive pre-acquisition planning to manage the risks. All right, so what constitutes a risky site? Well, you have many opportunities and times that you're going to face opposition to your development projects. And this might include something like neighborhood opposition, where you have NIMBYs, the not in my backyarders, who do not want to see the development process go forward. It creates a risk on site development. There are folks who are totally anti-growth. They do not particularly believe in it. They think that the character of the community is fine the way it is. They do not want to see change. And then there are those who are anti-gentrification. They're concerned about the changing character of the neighborhood and the fact that the property value may price them out of the neighborhood and force them to leave and totally change their living standards from where they're at. There is also legislative or political opposition that occurs. Sometimes these are wrapped around things like growth issues. Even politicians can be averse to growth themselves, depending upon where they are and their particular orientation and political ideology. They may be anti-change. They may look at it and say, I like the community the way it is, just like some of the neighbors and some of the folks that live in the neighborhood believe. There may be those that are opposed to changing the community character and have concerns about what it means to change the community character. And then there's potentially some that are concerned about the cost of changing or updating or improving infrastructure to meet the requirements for the new development. All of these can pose a risk to your development project and make the site become a risky site. Then there's a potential from the exposure of natural hazards. Of course, we are all realizing the effects these days of climate change. We see it frequently every day on the news, that the storm intensities, the storm frequencies, the other natural hazards occurring like forest fires and landslides are affecting every community, and the chance that these kind of climate change derived actions are going to pose a risk to your site are just increasing on a regular basis. Then there's a cost of adding to adaptation. Your cost to adapt to these natural hazards can make it very risky to develop a site because there are unforeseen costs associated with that sometimes, and you have to consider that when going into the effort to try to develop that property where a natural hazard might impact it at some point during development or thereafter. And then there's the potential for liabilities for misdesign claims. Misdesign claims that come out of the fact that post-construction, a natural hazard has impacted the property and damaged it or caused a liability to the owner or the tenant may stimulate their desire to go ahead and make a claim for misdesign on the property. So natural hazards can pose a risk to site development. And of course, last but not least, my favorite and one I've been involved in for many, many years in my career, which is the historically contaminated land. Particular historically contaminated land has unto itself its own set of risks, but they can be well defined. All contaminated land is not undevelopable. It can be redeveloped. There's a long history of it, and it goes across a very broad spectrum, as a matter of fact. Many people find that many sites that they are going in to develop will have impacts on our contamination that were unexpected, and yet they're still there. But historically contaminated land is ultimately what we're going to be talking about more and during this webinar. So why even bother targeting a risky site for acquisition and development? Well, basically because in urban and suburban, and maybe even marginal rural communities, it has grown more difficult to find a well-positioned property that is void of historical use and activities that have left behind some level of environmental impact. Now, what does that look like? Well, think of the active or abandoned corner gas station or auto repair facility. A former standalone dry cleaner or a strip mall that has or may have had a dry cleaning operation involved in it at some point. A past or present print shop in a community could be a risky site. Of course, a golf course. Golf courses are very much so locations that chemicals were routinely used on for maintenance purposes and may have had operational areas where chemicals were stored and may have been mixed or even distributed or disposed of, or some kind of maintenance activities may have contributed to contamination of those areas. But golf courses in general always have impacts on them. And often they are the locations of the largest tracts of property within and embedded within residential communities, which makes them very attractive for redevelopment, especially if the course has been abandoned and is waiting for someone to come along and improve it. Now, agricultural tracts, of course, also have impacts on them, residual impacts from their usage of agrochemicals to propagate crops over the years, or also like a golf course, an operations area where chemical storage or maintenance of equipment and the like, or fuel storage have left behind some legacy impacts. And as we expand our urban development areas, or even our suburban development areas, we're encompassing more and more of the agricultural tract redevelopment work. And it becomes incumbent upon us to consider these as risky sites and really plan for their development in advance. And then there are the classic of historically contaminated type sites, which pose a risk to development, which is your abandoned manufacturing plants, just like the one we saw on the previous picture. These are historically contaminated properties sitting out there for decades, if not longer, that have residual chemicals that are fairly concentrated and highly contaminated. However, their situation, their location makes them very attractive for redevelopment. There is existing infrastructure that's in place that can be reutilized for development and can really kind of help defray the costs of having to deal with the contamination. So they are really one of the well-known products and well-known sites where cleanup and contamination has occurred over the decades through programs like brownfields or voluntary cleanup, and have really kind of revitalized communities by bringing them back to use as usable properties. And then there are other such sites throughout the realm of commercial real estate. So any acquisition, and we're not just talking property acquisition here, we're talking about any acquisition, regardless of character or purpose, requires some form of due diligence. Investopedia has a relatively simple yet succinct definition of due diligence, and that is the care a reasonable person should take before entering into an agreement or a financial transaction with another party. Pretty common sense. Seems to be that when you want to buy something, when you want to acquire something, you take a hard look at it, you do your due diligence in advance to know what you're buying. So due diligence for any acquisition depends upon a couple of things. One of those is the type of acquisition. The type of acquisition will determine the shape and form of the due diligence. And due diligence involves investigation and appraisal activities by multiple disciplines, predominantly those involving accounting and financing, legal counsel, and environmental reviews. But fundamentally, The process relies on retrospective reviews that evaluate historical activities or expose past problems that can translate to risks and liabilities to the prospective buyer. So earlier on in this presentation, we discussed the aspects of risk management. The words proactive management and strategic actions are critical parts of the process we determined. So how can a buyer identify and manage the possible risks and associated liabilities of a potentially lucrative transaction? What must be done to qualify an investment and establish a strategy to maximize its return on investment? The answer was developed many years ago. Conduct strategic due diligence. Well, what's strategic due diligence? Well, simply, it's widely used practice used by due diligence professionals that specialize in mergers and acquisitions. The process is intentional. It not only investigates and assesses the current condition and historical record of the target acquisition, it considers and incorporates the future purpose and plans for the acquired asset. In other words, it considers all aspects of the acquisition and how they will be utilized, abandoned, or improved to meet the goals of maximizing the return on investment for the transaction. Now, we'll get into the real focus of this presentation. How can the well-known and widely used process of strategic due diligence be applied to the acquisition and development of risky sites? By implementing strategic environmental due diligence, a process of assessing the risks relative to planned development, the calculation of the associated costs to address those risks, and the incorporation of those costs into the target return on investment. In essence, apply the principles of strategic due diligence conducted for mergers and acquisitions to the acquisition of property, and specifically for potentially risky sites. For commercial real estate industry, environmental due diligence performed is the process by which a prospective buyer scrutinizes and evaluates a potential land acquisition. Now, the standard environmental due diligence for CRE is typically, when investors and prospective purchasers consider doing it, to be a checkbox requirement on a loan application, and typically request the process be performed when all other due diligence aspects for property acquisition have been fully evaluated. But in reality, environmental due diligence is performed to qualify the buyer for landowner liability protections, known as LLPs, under federal law. That law is the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, or CERCLA, otherwise called the Superfund Act. To qualify for landowner liability protections, environmental due diligence must be performed pursuant to the stipulations of the US EPA's All Appropriate Inquiry Rule, otherwise known as AAI. In a nutshell, all appropriate inquiry is the process of evaluating a commercial property's environmental condition and assessing the buyer's potential liability for any contamination. Remember, we're talking about standard environmental due diligence. So to satisfy the provisions of the All Appropriate Inquiry Rule, environmental due diligence must be conducted in accordance with the American Society of Testing Materials, or ASTM, designation E1527, which is known as the standard practice for environmental site assessments, phase 1 environmental site assessment process. Now, this standard was first established by the ASTM probably more than 25 years ago to bring consistency to the process and the product, the final phase 1 environmental site assessment report you all receive when you do your property due diligence. But it has generally been updated every 5 years since then, And the most recent update was in 2021. That update, however, was only formally accepted recently by the EPA to qualify for all appropriate inquiry earlier this year. So the performance of standard environmental due diligence is meant to offer landowner liability protections. But when it comes to risky sites, developing and implementing a plan of strategic environmental due diligence not only offers the same liability protections, but it can also help to manage the risks and maximize your return on investment. So where does strategic environmental due diligence differ from standard environmental due diligence? Well, strategic environmental due diligence is a process that integrates the investigation of a property's history, which includes things like its history of development, the changes in development over the years, what it was used for, its purpose, how that has changed over the years, who occupied the property, what operations and activities may have occurred on the property, and how those may have changed over the years, and potentially even the design of the property and how that might have morphed or changed throughout its history. But this strategic environmental due diligence also incorporates the identification of environmental impacts and potential liabilities based on the site's condition, based on its regulatory record, and based on whether there is known or perceived contamination on the property. It doesn't stop there, though. Strategic environmental due diligence also considers assessment of known and suspected impacts to develop the data needed to determine the essential response and risk. So the development of data would be identifying the presence, extent, variety, and significance of contaminants on the site, and particularly the significance to the development goals. Also considers the potential of offsite migration, which could pose an extreme liability to the potential development of the site. And then also gives you the data and information needed to really kind of determine what your cleanup looks like and what your closure strategy options are, and potentially allowing you to develop an idea of cost for that. And strategic environmental due diligence will include a comparison of plan development to impacts and the evaluation of whether costs or efforts to address liabilities can be managed and incorporated to achieve your target return on investment. In other words, it can determine if the development design elements and the development process can be cost effectively incorporated into the cleanup and closure strategy. Design as part of your strategy to address the contamination. And finally, strategic environmental due diligence uses the model of risk-based corrective action to achieve regulatory approval for response actions and target property development goals. This allows some contamination to remain controlled by elements of development design with the application of documented restrictions. You keep your contamination, or most of your contamination, on the site, and you use your design elements of your development to control them, and then provide some kind of documented restriction on the property use or the deed itself in terms of resources to limit exposure. So what are the steps to reducing the risk of developing risky sites? We'll start with number one: to achieve the target return on investment, create and execute a plan for strategic environmental due diligence for sites with known or perceived contamination. This means start developing a plan for strategic environmental due diligence with your initial evaluations of interest in the acquisition. There is some level of information available to you with the assistance of your counsel, with the assistance of your environmental consultant, that will probably be able to provide you with at least a preliminary information on the condition of the site and what you might want to consider in your planning and your actual determination of interest in acquisition. Number two, plan to extend the assessment beyond phase 2 contaminant presence or identification testing. However, it must be remembered that testing must follow the regulatory protocol. You are going to eventually be giving this information to the regulatory framework, and then those folks must be able to evaluate the information you provide them in accordance with their rules. So you must follow those rules and test in accordance with their protocols. Number 3, generate a preliminary conceptual site model to define the contaminants of concern in all media. So based on your preliminary known or suspected activities and associated sources of contamination, you want to create a model kind of outlining where you believe the contamination might exist on the property, might consist of, and work from there in designing what your investigations look like beyond the initial evaluation or phase 1 environmental site assessment. So you're moving beyond that into the realm of defining what your testing will look like, and needing to follow the regulatory framework. And you will base that on developing the initial conceptual site model. Number 4, during the environmental due diligence phase, identify the risks and liabilities and define the extensive impact. The results of the assessment will likely require you to modify that initial conceptual site model and update it as you go along. There is anticipation that additional testing might have to follow the initial amount of testing and still remain within that regulatory framework, but be totally it's substantial enough to meet the obligations of submittal to the regulatory for a determination of the next phase of work. Number 5, choose an acceptable risk-based option for closure of contamination. Risk-based options for closure may involve the required implementation of institutional engineering controls, depending upon the degree of extent of contamination. Institutional controls being those kinds of things like deed restrictions or limitations of use of the property, and engineering controls being the kind of physical structures applied to the property or used on the property as a part of the development, as a part of your product, if you will, to kind of limit or prevent exposure to the remnant contamination we leave behind. Number 6, develop or modify the site design to integrate with the chosen risk-based closure goal. Now, this means you design around and account for the contamination. So whatever you're planning to build out there, if you can consider how it needs to assist with preventing exposure to contamination, how it can allow you to leave some contamination in places. Maybe a good example might be a detention lake, digging up some of the contaminated soil from the lake and using it elsewhere on the property as long as it sits under some kind of engineering control or cap. You've eliminated 2 sources, a source of contamination, and turned it into a usable stormwater control structure, at the same time giving yourself the option to reutilize the soil on the site and just put it under something that's going to prevent exposure from future occupants and visitors. Number 7, develop a strategy and a timeline to achieve the risk-based closure. Now, this is essential to meeting return on investment goals. We've talked about how being strategic, being proactive is a risk management process. So if you're looking toward maximizing your return on investment, take the moments to develop those plans, be strategic about them, and look towards incorporating costs into your development for cleanup that are going to at least give you a sense of how much return on investment you can achieve from the effort. Number 8, engage regulators to establish a relationship and buy-in to the strategy and timeline to achieve closure. This is pretty common sense for many of us. Allow the regulators to be your partner in the process. They want to help. They do not want contaminated properties to sit idle and unaddressed. They want to help you achieve your objective and endpoint goal. They would like to see a contaminated property be redeveloped. So engage them early on and really kind of get them to buy into the project site. And you'll find that they really do become a partner in the process to you and really help you move it along to its endpoint quicker than if you don't. Number 9, create a plan and budget to manage the impacts prior to and during the development phase. So incorporate your costs to assess and mitigate the contamination into the acquisition and development financial model, and give yourself a sense of how that's going to impact your bottom line. Does it pencil the project? Does it give you the return on investment you're looking for? And how do you manage all of that to provide you with that return on investment? Number 10, incorporate your cleanup actions into your site development activities. Don't clean up the site before you start developing, clean up the site when you're developing it. And then keep the regulators routinely informed of the process. When you implement your cleanup as part of site development phase, you're moving your dirt and your groundwater at that point, and that is the best time to address the contamination. And make sure you keep your regulatory partners in the loop on the progress of the job. That keeps them interested, and it also keeps them in the loop of moving this thing forward without having to worry about any kind of concerns about additional contamination issues. They will deal with it, and they will give you the pathway forward. And 11, finally, request closure of contamination upon regulatory approval of the cleanup, the final accomplishment of the strategy for developing risky sites is going through your closure. So, facing risks of contamination on risky sites that pose uncertainty on development objectives, which is the definition of risk, as we saw, creating a strategic environmental due diligence plan during the pre-acquisition phase of the project can improve the potential to maximize return on investment. That completes our presentation, and I will open up the floor to any questions. I've opened up the chat. Q&A is open if anybody has any questions. All right, well, my information is up there, my contact information, my phone number, my email address, as well as the name and phone number and email address of our environmental department director, John Abbott. Please, if you have any questions after the fact, if you think of any, don't be afraid to reach out and inquire. Be happy to help you with this process. If you're looking at a risky site, we definitely want to hear from you. And if you've got questions about that and maybe you need some assistance, we'll be more than happy to provide some background information and assist in any way that we possibly can. Well, thank you so much for attending today's event. We do have a question from Greg Souter. Is the process the same for expansions or further development of existing sites? Really good question, Greg. It depends. If it's a contaminated site with no contamination on it, then I think you already have a basis of knowledge to work from. But it doesn't hurt at all to develop a strategy for expansion or further development of an existing site that's already known to be contaminated. If there are sites where there are no contamination, but you suspect that some kind of expansion or continued development might actually intercept with contaminated property, portions of the property, then for sure, having some kind of strategic plan in advance to work with that is advisable. Can we get a copy of the webinar? Let me check with our folks in our social media group and see what we can do about that. Miguel, how about sending me your email address?
Hey, I just want to chime in here, Mike. Yeah, all attendees we will be emailing out a copy of the webinar recording after the fact to everybody, as well as a key takeaway spreadsheet for everybody so they can reference.
Okay, Michael McGraw asks, are there any additional documents or publications available on this subject matter? There is a white paper that I put out about this. It's not as detailed as this webinar in terms of some of the step-by-step stuff. There are, I think, a fair amount of regulatory publications on risk-based corrective actions and any number of, I think, research documents and studies that have been done on this kind of work. So as far as giving you immediate links with that, on that, I don't have any that I could probably send out right now, but if you want to email me, I'll be happy to try to dig some out or do a web search. There are properties. Look at risk-based corrective action, look at brownfields and the like, voluntary cleanup activities. Most states have a program where they allow people to do a voluntary cleanup. And in particular, the risk-based corrective action subject matter provides a lot of the basis of information you need when you're dealing with a risky site development. Michael Burke, you asked, what about projects that originate with municipalities versus private efforts? Good question. Site development with public entities still would qualify, I believe, for the same considerations, regardless, when it comes to regulatory framework. So effectively, regardless of whether it's privately funded or publicly funded, and you're encountering contamination, it's not a bad idea to develop a strategic plan for the due diligence and think about that. I guess it depends upon the risk management strategy of the public entity, or even the private entity for that matter, because like I said, there are some people that are totally risk averse, that the hint of contamination will drive them to not particular enthusiasm about acquiring the property and they'll walk away from it. But really and truly, the cardinal rule of commercial real estate is what? Location, location, location. So walking away from contaminated sites in really good locations, not always the most rewarding strategy, for sure. But thanks for the question. Different steps. Elaborate, Michael, please. What do you mean by different steps? And Michael, can you elaborate on that question about different steps? Oh, okay, very good. All right. So yes, thank you so much for coming and attending today and for the excellent questions. There's no one single answer. I will tell you that. Every site is different. Especially, you would think that one golf course would be the same as the next golf course. They are not. You would think that one factory might be the same as another factory. They are not. Same thing, dry cleaners, gas stations. No site will provide the same levels of contamination, the same extent of contamination, and the same response actions. So when you're looking at something, don't expect it to be cookie cutter. Every risky site will be its own project unto itself, and you really have to spend time creating your strategy to how to deal with that. So, like I said, there's my information. There's contact information for myself and John Abbott, and we'd love to dive into whatever you're considering to help you with it. Oh, there are more. Okay, Great. Thank you for attending today. Appreciate that, and tell your friends and family.